The helicopter's rotors cut through the thick Christmas Eve air as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison studied the mission briefing one final time. 18 Navy SEALs sat in the cramped cabin, their faces painted black, weapons checked and rechecked. The intel was solid. A high-value terrorist target had been spotted in a remote compound deep in the Louisiana bayou. What should have been a straightforward extraction was about to become something none of them would ever forget. 2 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through Morrison's headset. Below them stretched endless miles of murky swampland, Spanish moss hanging like ghostly curtains from ancient cypress trees. The water reflected the pale moonlight, creating an otherworldly landscape that seemed more suited to horror movies than military operations. Morrison's team had been pulled from their Christmas leave for this mission. Intelligence suggested that Khalil Hassan, a bomb maker responsible for attacks on 3 American embassies, was hiding in an abandoned fishing camp 20 miles into the swamp. Local law enforcement couldn't reach him. The terrain was too treacherous, and Hassan's men had booby-trapped the only access routes. Petty Officer First Class Danny Cruz adjusted his night vision goggles and checked his rifle for the 100th time. At 28, he'd been on more missions than he could count, but something felt different about this one. Maybe it was the Christmas timing, or maybe it was the complete radio silence they'd maintained since leaving the base. Either way, his instincts were telling him to stay extra sharp. LZ coming up, the pilot announced. The landing zone was a small clearing about 2 miles from the target compound. From there, the SEALs would move through the swamp on foot, using the cover of darkness to approach undetected. The helicopter touched down with barely a whisper, its skilled pilot setting them down so gently that the tall grass barely bent. Morrison was first out, followed by his 17 men. They moved like shadows, each SEAL knowing exactly where to go without needing orders. Within seconds, the helicopter lifted off, leaving them alone in the vast Louisiana wilderness. The silence was immediate and total. No city sounds, no traffic, no human noise at all. Just the gentle lapping of water against the muddy banks, and the occasional splash of something large moving through the swamp. Morrison hand-signaled his team into formation, 2 four-man fire teams flanking a central group of 10, with himself and Cruz taking point. They began their approach through terrain that seemed designed to kill. The ground beneath their feet was never solid. Sometimes muddy earth that tried to suck their boots clean off, sometimes floating mats of vegetation that could support a man's weight or dump him into 10 feet of black water without warning. Cypress knees jutted up like broken bones, and every shadow could hide an alligator or worse. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Williams, the team's medic, caught Morrison's attention and pointed to his watch. They'd been moving for an hour and covered less than half the distance to the target. At this rate, they'd missed their window of opportunity. Hassan's intelligence contacts had warned him about increased American activity in the region. He might already be preparing to move. Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of continuing their careful advance through the safest route, he decided to cut across a large, open stretch of swamp water. His GPS showed it as shallow, and it would save them 40 minutes of dangerous ground movement. The water was indeed shallow at first, maybe 18 inches deep, warm from the day's heat despite the December air. The SEALs moved in single file, Morrison leading, each man placing his feet exactly where the man in front of him had stepped. Their weapons were held high to keep them dry, and their night vision painted everything in shades of green and black. They were halfway across when Cruz noticed something wrong. "Sir," he whispered into his throat mic, "the water's getting deeper." Morrison looked down. The water that had been at his shins was now at his knees, and rising. But they were already committed. Turning back would take longer than pushing forward. "Keep moving," he ordered quietly. That's when they heard the first shot. The bullet cracked past Morrison's head, so close he felt the air displacement. Before he could react, automatic weapons fire erupted from 3 different positions around the swamp. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks as Hassan's men opened up with AK-47s from concealed positions in the cypress trees. "Contact left. Contact right. Contact front." The shouts came from multiple team members as they identified firing positions. The SEALs immediately returned fire, but they were caught in the worst possible position, standing in open water with no cover, lit up by moonlight like targets in a shooting gallery. Morrison tried to move toward the nearest solid ground, but his foot sank into soft mud up to his knee. He was stuck, and, around him, his men were discovering the same terrifying truth. The shallow water they'd been crossing was actually a mud flat covered by a thin layer of water. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. "We're trapped," Williams shouted over the gunfire. "The bottom's pure mud. I can't move." Cruz tried to help Morrison pull free, but his own movement only caused him to sink deeper. Within minutes, all 18 SEALs were trapped in the sucking mud, unable to advance or retreat, taking fire from multiple directions with nowhere to go. The enemy fire was disciplined and accurate. Hassan's men had clearly been watching the SEALs approach and had chosen this moment to spring their trap perfectly. Bullets whined overhead and splashed into the water around them. It was only a matter of time before someone got hit. Morrison's mind raced through their options. He tried his radio, but they were too far from base for direct communication, and their satellite relay wouldn't connect from this low position. The helicopter wouldn't return for extraction unless they called it in, and that was impossible. They were completely on their own. "Sir, we've got movement in the trees," reported Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Anderson from the rear of the formation. "I count at least 12 muzzle flashes, maybe more." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Several of his men were sinking up to their waists now, and the enemy fire was becoming more concentrated. Morrison realized with growing horror that Hassan's men were taking their time, methodically targeting each SEAL position. They knew their enemies couldn't escape. A bullet caught Petty Officer James Rodriguez in the shoulder, spinning him around with a grunt of pain. Williams immediately tried to move to help him, but the medic was stuck just as firmly as everyone else. Rodriguez would have to treat himself as best he could while continuing to fight. "We need to thin out their numbers," Morrison said into his radio. "Designated marksman, pick your targets." Chief Petty Officer Sam Mitchell, the team's best sniper, tried to line up a shot through his scope. But every time he raised his rifle, the movement caused him to sink a little deeper into the mud. "I can't get stable, sir," he reported. "Every shot throws off my position." The enemy seemed to understand this too. Their fire became more aggressive, forcing the SEALs to keep their heads down. What had been a careful, methodical assault was turning into a turkey shoot. Morrison felt something he'd never experienced in 15 years of military service: helplessness. His men were depending on him, and he had no answers. They were trapped, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. Worst of all, nobody knew where they were. If they died here, it might be days or weeks before anyone found their bodies. "Sir," Cruz said quietly, his voice strained from the effort of fighting the mud, "I've got an idea. What if we use the mud? Instead of fighting it, what if we go under it? Move along the bottom towards solid ground?" Morrison considered it. The idea was desperate, but it might work. If they could submerge completely, the enemy would lose visual contact. They might be able to move underwater toward the trees where they could find cover and fight back effectively. "Too risky," Williams said when Morrison explained the plan. "We don't know how deep this stuff goes. And if someone gets stuck underwater, we'd never get them out in time." Another burst of gunfire cut through their discussion. This time, bullets struck dangerously close to Petty Officer Mike Santos, forcing him to duck down until his nose was barely above water. They were running out of time and options. That's when Morrison heard something that made no sense at all: the sound of a single rifle shot, different from the enemy's automatic weapons. This was a precise, measured shot from a high-powered rifle. Then another. Then a third. One by one, the enemy muzzle flashes began going dark. "What the hell?" Mitchell muttered, trying to see through his scope what was happening. "Someone's taking out their positions." The enemy fire slackened noticeably. Where there had been a dozen or more firing positions, now there were only half that number. And the shots kept coming, single, precise rifle reports that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Morrison scanned the tree line with his night vision, looking for their mysterious ally. He caught a glimpse of movement high in a massive cypress tree about 300 yards away, just a shadow among shadows, but definitely human. As he watched, another enemy position went silent. "Who was that?" Anderson whispered over the radio. "We got backup we don't know about?" Morrison checked his communications again. Still nothing. No contact with base, no word of any other friendly forces in the area. Whoever was helping them wasn't military, at least not officially. The sniper was methodical and devastatingly accurate. Each shot seemed to find its target despite the difficult conditions, shooting at night, through swamp vegetation, at targets that were concealed and camouflaged. It was the kind of marksmanship that took years to develop and nerves of steel to execute under pressure. Within 10 minutes, the enemy fire had been reduced to sporadic shots from just 2 or 3 positions. The mysterious sniper had eliminated more than half of Hassan's men without missing a single shot. But Morrison's team was still trapped in the mud, and now they faced a new uncertainty. Who was their rescuer, and what did they want? Movement in the water, Santos reported suddenly. Someone's coming toward us. Through the darkness, Morrison could see a figure moving through the swamp with impossible grace. While his 18 trained SEALs were stuck fast in the mud, this person glided across the same terrain like they were walking on solid ground. They moved from cypress knee to floating log to hidden solid spots with the confidence of someone who knew this swamp like their own backyard. As the figure got closer, Morrison's night vision revealed details that shocked him. It was a woman, probably in her 30s, wearing simple hunting clothes and carrying what looked like a custom-built sniper rifle. She had long dark hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and her face showed the kind of calm focus Morrison had only seen in the most experienced combat veterans. She stopped about 20 yards away from the trapped SEALs, standing on what appeared to be solid ground. For a long moment, she studied them with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. Their positions, their weapons, the tactical situation, and their predicament. "You boys picked a hell of a place for a Christmas Eve swim," she said in a voice that carried easily across the water. Her accent was local Louisiana, with the slow drawl of someone who'd lived their entire life in the bayou. Morrison didn't know how to respond. Military protocol hadn't prepared him for being rescued by a lone woman with a rifle who'd appeared out of nowhere. "Ma'am, we're United States Navy SEALs conducting a classified operation. I need to advise you that. I know who you are," she interrupted. "And I know why you're here. Khalil Hassan's been using my family's old fishing camp for the past 2 months. I've been watching him and his men, waiting for the right moment." She shifted her rifle to a more comfortable position and looked around at the remaining enemy positions. 2 more shots rang out from the darkness. Apparently the woman wasn't the only sniper in the swamp tonight. "Those would be my brothers," she explained matter-of-factly. "We don't much like terrorists using our property." Morrison's mind was spinning. A family of snipers living in the Louisiana swamp, conducting their own surveillance of a high-value terrorist target? It sounded like something out of a movie, but the evidence was all around him. Hassan's men were being systematically eliminated by people who knew this terrain better than anyone. "Ma'am, we need immediate assistance," Morrison said, setting aside his confusion for the moment. "My men are trapped in this mud. We have 1 wounded, and we can't complete our mission like this." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "I can see that. Y'all aren't the first soldiers to get caught in that mud flat. We've pulled out 3 different groups of drug runners over the years. The trick is knowing where to step." She disappeared into the darkness for a moment, then returned with a coil of rope and what looked like a small aluminum boat. With movements that seemed effortless, she began setting up a pulley system using nearby trees, creating mechanical advantage to extract the SEALs from their muddy trap. "One at a time," she called out. "And don't fight the mud. Let it release you gradually, or you'll just sink deeper." As the first SEAL was slowly pulled free, Morrison found himself studying this mysterious woman who'd appeared at exactly the right moment to save their lives. Everything about her suggested extensive combat experience. The way she held her rifle, how she scanned for threats, her calm demeanor under pressure. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what's your background?" he said as she worked. She glanced at him with what might have been amusement. "Marine Corps, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Came home to find terrorists in my backyard." She paused in her work to eliminate another enemy position with a single shot. "Some problems follow you home, whether you want them to or not." The extraction continued methodically, each SEAL pulled free and directed to solid ground where they could reposition and provide better covering fire. The mysterious sniper family continued their own assault on Hassan's remaining forces, each shot precise and deadly. But, as Morrison's team regained their mobility, he realized their mission had become infinitely more complicated. They were no longer just hunting Hassan. They were now part of someone else's operation, conducted by people whose motivations and methods were unknown. The last SEAL pulled free from the mud was Rodriguez, still clutching his wounded shoulder, but refusing help as he found his footing on solid ground. Morrison's team was finally mobile again, but their situation had changed dramatically. What started as a classified military operation had become something else entirely. The mysterious woman watched Morrison's men regroup with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen combat units under stress. Her rifle remained ready, but she made no threatening moves. Around them, the swamp had grown quieter. The systematic elimination of Hassan's sentries was nearly complete. "My name's Sarah Tran," she said, finally, offering an introduction. "This is my family's land, and Hassan's been using it without permission." Morrison studied her more carefully now that he wasn't fighting for his life. Sarah Tran looked to be in her mid-30s, with the lean build of someone who spent their life moving through difficult terrain. Her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare Morrison recognized in seasoned combat veterans. She'd seen things that changed a person permanently. "Ma'am, we appreciate your assistance," Morrison said formally, "but this is still a classified military operation. I need to ask you to withdraw to a safe distance while we complete our mission." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Lieutenant Commander, you've been stumbling around my backyard for 2 hours, and it took me and my brothers 30 minutes to do what your 18 men couldn't: neutralize Hassan's outer security. You really want to do this the hard way?" Before Morrison could respond, 2 more figures emerged from the swamp like ghosts materializing from the darkness. Both were men, clearly Sarah's brothers based on their similar features and movements. They carried rifles with the same casual competence Sarah displayed, and their approach made no sound at all despite the treacherous terrain. "This is Marcus and David," Sarah said. "We've been tracking Hassan's operation for 8 weeks now. We know his patrol patterns, his security protocols, and exactly where he's hiding." The older brother, Marcus, stepped forward. He was a big man with prematurely gray hair and scars on his hands that spoke of military service. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Morrison with the respect of one soldier to another, "we understand your position. But Hassan's got 26 men in that compound, not the 12 your intelligence suggested. He's also got claymore mines on every approach route, and at least 2 machine gun nests." Morrison felt his blood run cold. If their intelligence was that far off, his team was walking into a massacre. Military planning depended on accurate information, and apparently their information was completely wrong. "How do you know all this?" Chief Williams asked suspiciously. David, the younger brother, answered. He was lean and dark-haired with the quiet intensity of a professional scout. "Because we've been inside. Hassan's men aren't just hiding, they're processing something. Chemical weapons, we think. They've got a lab set up in the main building." This information changed everything. If Hassan was manufacturing chemical weapons in a remote location, the threat level had just escalated beyond a simple capture mission. Morrison's team wasn't equipped for chemical warfare scenarios, and they certainly couldn't risk allowing those weapons to be deployed or moved. Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. "That's why we've been watching instead of acting. We needed to know what we were dealing with before making any moves." Morrison's radio suddenly crackled to life, the first communication they'd had since landing. "Bravo team, this is command. We're showing enemy radio traffic indicating your position may be compromised. What's your status?" Morrison hesitated before responding. Military protocol demanded that he report contact with unknown civilians, especially ones who claimed to have intelligence about their target. But these civilians had just saved his team's lives and seemed to know more about the situation than his own command did. "Command, we've encountered unexpected resistance and are reassessing our approach. Request extended timeline for mission completion." "Negative, Bravo team. Intelligence indicates Hassan may be moving his operation within hours. Mission timeline remains unchanged." Morrison closed his eyes in frustration. Command was pushing for immediate action based on flawed intelligence, while the people who actually knew the situation were telling him it was far more dangerous than anticipated. Sarah watched this exchange with interest. Your commanders don't know about the chemical lab, do they? No, ma'am, they don't. Then, you've got a choice to make, she said quietly. Follow orders based on bad information and probably get your men killed, or work with people who actually know what you're facing. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low but intense. Lieutenant Commander, we've lost friends to Hassan's bombs. Our father was killed in the embassy attack in Kenya. This isn't just about territory for us. It's personal. The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. Sarah's family weren't just local residents who discovered terrorists in their backyard. They were survivors seeking justice for their father's murder. Their involvement in this operation went far deeper than he'd realized. Sir, Cruz said quietly, we need to make a decision. Standing here debating isn't helping anyone. Morrison looked around at his men. They were all watching him, waiting for orders, trusting his judgment to keep them alive. The smart military decision was to withdraw, report the new intelligence, and wait for properly equipped reinforcements. But Hassan might be gone by then, and those chemical weapons would disappear into the black market forever. What do you propose? He asked Sarah. She knelt down and began drawing in the muddy ground with a stick. The compound's built on the only solid ground for miles around. It's actually an old Choctaw Indian settlement site. There's a main building where Hassan's staying, 2 guard towers, and 6 smaller buildings including the lab. Her diagram showed remarkable detail, including sight lines, defensive positions, and what appeared to be an escape route through the swamp that wouldn't show up on any satellite imagery. The direct approach from any direction gets you killed. Marcus continued the briefing. But there's an old smuggler's tunnel that runs from the bayou directly under the main compound. It was built during Prohibition, and Hassan's men don't know about it. David added his own information. We've been using it to monitor their radio communications and observe their operations. The tunnel emerges inside the compound's central courtyard, behind their main defensive positions. Morrison studied the crude map, his tactical mind racing. It was an audacious plan. Infiltrate through a hidden tunnel system, strike from inside the compound while the enemy expected attacks from outside. But it required trusting people he'd known for less than an hour with the lives of his entire team. Why are you helping us? He asked bluntly. You could have eliminated Hassan yourselves if you'd wanted to. Sarah's expression hardened. Because we're not assassins, Lieutenant Commander. We're Americans who want justice done properly. Hassan needs to be captured alive, tried, and convicted. That takes resources we don't have. Plus, Marcus added with grim humor, 18 Navy SEALs give us better odds of surviving whatever Hassan's got planned for uninvited guests. Rodriguez, who'd been quiet while Williams treated his shoulder wound, finally spoke up. Sir, I vote we trust them. My grandmother always said that when guardian angels show up, you don't question their credentials. Several other SEALs murmured agreement. They'd all seen enough combat to recognize competence when they encountered it, and Sarah's family had already proven their skills convincingly. Morrison made his decision. All right, we work together. But this is still my mission, and my men follow my orders. Can you accept that? Sarah nodded. Your mission, our territory, shared objectives. We can work with that. The combined group began moving toward the tunnel entrance, with Sarah leading and her brothers providing rear security. The difference in their movement was immediately apparent. Where the SEALs had struggled through the swamp terrain, the Trans moved like they were walking on sidewalks. How long have you lived out here? Chief Mitchell asked as they walked. Born and raised, David replied. Our family's been in this bayou for 4 generations. We know every tree, every stream, every piece of solid ground. And you all served military? Williams inquired. Marines, Sarah confirmed. Marcus did 3 tours in Iraq. I did 2 in Afghanistan. David did 1 in Syria. We came home thinking we were done fighting. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a curtain of Spanish moss and required crawling through a narrow opening that looked like nothing more than a small cave. Sarah disappeared inside first, followed by Morrison, then the rest of the team one by one. Inside, the tunnel was larger than expected, clearly built for moving significant contraband during the Prohibition era. The walls were shored up with cypress timbers that had lasted nearly a century, and The floor was solid stone that allowed quiet movement. "It's about 400 yards to the compound," Sarah whispered as they moved through the darkness. The tunnel was built to avoid the soft ground and comes up in what used to be the main house's root cellar. The tunnel journey felt longer than 400 yards as Morrison's mind raced through contingencies. They were committed now, no easy retreat, no backup plan if things went wrong. His team was following strangers through a hidden passage toward a target that was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Halfway through the tunnel, Sarah stopped suddenly and held up her hand for silence. In the distance, they could hear voices speaking in Arabic. Hassan's men were close enough that their conversation carried down through the tunnel ventilation system. "Laboratory protocols," Marcus whispered, translating. "They're discussing mixing procedures and safety protocols. Definitely chemical weapons." The reality of what they were walking into became even more stark. Not only were they outnumbered and using an untested infiltration route, they were potentially dealing with chemical weapons that could kill them all if accidentally released during the assault. Sarah continued forward, her movements even more careful now. At the tunnel's end, a wooden ladder led up to what appeared to be a trapdoor covered with decades of dirt and debris. Light filtered down through small gaps, indicating they were directly beneath the compound. "This comes up in the old root cellar," Sarah whispered. "The building above is Hassan's personal quarters. Once we open this, there's no going back." Morrison looked back at his men, seeing determination and trust in their faces despite everything they'd been through. These were the finest warriors America produced, and they were ready to follow him into whatever waited above. "On my mark," he whispered, hand on his rifle. "Remember, Hassan needs to be taken alive if possible. Everyone else is hostile." Sarah positioned herself at the ladder, ready to push open the trapdoor. Behind her, 18 SEALs and 2 Marine veterans prepared for what might be their final battle. The Christmas Eve silence above them was about to be shattered forever. Sarah slowly pushed open the trapdoor, and the smell hit them immediately, a chemical tang that made Morrison's eyes water and sent alarm bells ringing in his head. This wasn't just a hideout. Hassan's men were actively producing chemical weapons directly above their heads. The root cellar was dark and cramped, filled with old wooden shelves and the musty smell of decades-old preserves. Sarah moved up first, her rifle ready, scanning the small space before motioning for Morrison to follow. One by one, the team climbed into the cellar, their movements silent despite the dangerous proximity to their targets. Through the ceiling above, they could hear footsteps and conversation in Arabic. The building was definitely occupied, and from the sound of it, multiple people were moving around actively. Morrison checked his watch, 2:47 a.m. In a normal hideout, most people would be sleeping, but Hassan's operation was clearly running around the clock. Sarah pointed to a narrow staircase leading up to the main floor. The wooden steps looked ancient, and Morrison worried they might creak under the weight of 21 armed people. But Sarah had obviously used these stairs before. She demonstrated how to step on the edges near the wall where the wood was best supported. The first floor of the building revealed why Hassan had chosen this location. The old house had been completely gutted and converted into a sophisticated laboratory. Stainless steel tables held chemical equipment, and several men in protective suits were working with materials that Morrison recognized as precursors for nerve gas. Through windows, Morrison could see the rest of the compound spread out under the moonlight. Guard towers positioned at 2 corners, smaller buildings that probably housed Hassan's soldiers, and clear fields of fire that would make any conventional assault nearly impossible. Sarah's intelligence had been completely accurate. Marcus appeared beside Morrison, having somehow climbed the stairs without making any noise at all. He pointed toward the back of the building where a hallway led to what appeared to be living quarters. "Hassan's room is the last door on the left," he whispered. "Usually 2 guards outside, plus whoever's in there with him." The chemical workers were so focused on their dangerous tasks that they hadn't noticed the armed figures moving through the shadows of their converted laboratory. Morrison realized they had a brief window of opportunity. The workers' protective suits limited their vision and hearing, making them temporarily vulnerable. He hand-signaled his team into position. Williams and Cruz moved to secure the chemical area. Their priority was preventing any accidental release of weapons that could kill everyone in the building. Mitchell and Anderson took positions covering the front entrance and guard towers. The rest of the team prepared to move on Hassan's quarters. Sarah caught Morrison's attention and pointed to a wall-mounted alarm system. If triggered, it would alert the entire compound and probably result in a massive firefight that could rupture the chemical containers. They needed to take control of the situation before anyone realized what was happening. Morrison made quick tactical decisions. His team would simultaneously secure the chemical lab, capture Hassan, and neutralize the compound's ability to mount organized resistance. It required perfect timing and coordination between people who'd never worked together before. On my mark, he whispered into his throat mic, trusting that Sarah and her brothers understood military communication protocols. The assault began with surgical precision. Williams and Cruz moved on the chemical workers, their suppressed weapons taking down 2 men before they could react. The third worker reached for an alarm button, but found David Tran's knife at his throat instead. Simultaneously, Morrison led 6 SEALs down the hallway toward Hassan's quarters. The 2 guards outside Hassan's door were eliminated silently, one by Morrison's suppressed pistol, the other by Chief Mitchell's knife. They breached the door to find Hassan himself sitting at a desk with what appeared to be shipping manifests and a satellite phone. Khalil Hassan was a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that showed no surprise at seeing armed Americans in his bedroom. He slowly raised his hands, studying Morrison's face with the calculating look of someone used to being hunted. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison," Hassan said in accented but perfect English. "You're earlier than I expected, but not unwelcome. I've been hoping to speak with American military leadership." Morrison kept his rifle trained on Hassan while his men secured the room and checked for additional threats. The casualness of Hassan's response was deeply troubling. This wasn't how high-value targets usually reacted to capture operations. "Khalil Hassan, you're under arrest for terrorism against United States citizens and allies," Morrison said formally. "You have the right to remain silent." "Actually, I don't think I do," Hassan interrupted with what might have been amusement. "You see, this entire situation has been carefully orchestrated. My presence here, your mission, even the timing, none of it is coincidental." Before Morrison could respond, Sarah's voice came through his earpiece. "We've got problems. The compound's perimeter guards are moving in. Looks like they were expecting trouble." Through Hassan's window, Morrison could see armed figures advancing on the main building from multiple directions. They moved with military precision, not the casual patrol patterns of guards responding to an alarm. These men had been positioned and ready for action. Hassan smiled at Morrison's expression. "The chemical laboratory was bait, Lieutenant Commander. We needed to draw in American Special Forces for reasons that will become clear very soon." "Sir, we need to move," Cruz's voice came through the radio. "More vehicles approaching from the main road. Whatever this is, it's bigger than we thought." Morrison's mind raced through possibilities, all of them bad. If Hassan had been expecting them, then someone had compromised their mission. That meant their extraction might also be compromised, their backup might not be coming, and they were potentially facing a much larger enemy force than anticipated. "What do you want?" Morrison asked Hassan directly. "A trade," Hassan replied calmly. "Information for safe passage. I can tell you who provided your mission intelligence, why you were really sent here, and what's actually in those chemical containers your medic is so worried about." The building shook suddenly, as an explosion went off somewhere in the compound. Through the windows, Morrison could see one of the guard towers collapsing in flames. Sarah and Marcus were obviously engaging the perimeter guards, but 18 SEALs and 3 local allies wouldn't last long against a prepared enemy force of unknown size. "Talk fast," Morrison said, pressing his rifle barrel against Hassan's forehead. "The chemical lab is real, but it's not producing nerve gas," Hassan explained quickly. "We're manufacturing antidotes, specifically antidotes to a biological weapon that's already been deployed in the United States." Morrison felt the world shift around him. What biological weapon? 3 days ago, someone released a modified influenza virus in 12 American cities. It's designed to be highly contagious, but relatively harmless for the first week. Then, it mutates into something far more deadly. The antidote can only be produced in specific environmental conditions, like a Louisiana swamp. The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. If Hassan was telling the truth, then the chemical lab wasn't a terrorist operation. It was potentially the only thing that could save millions of American lives. Who released the virus? Morrison demanded. Hassan's smile disappeared. The same people who sent you here to destroy the lab. Before Morrison could process this revelation, William's voice came over the radio with desperate urgency. Sir, the chemical containers, they're not weapons. They're medical supplies. And someone's rigged them with explosives. Morrison looked out the window to see Sarah and her brothers conducting a fighting withdrawal toward the main building, pursued by at least 30 armed figures in military gear. The entire compound was lit up with gunfire, and it was clear they were massively outnumbered. The explosives are on a timer, Hassan continued. If this building is destroyed, every dose of antidote goes with it. And the timer was activated the moment your team entered the compound. Morrison's radio crackled with multiple urgent reports from his team. The enemy force was larger than expected, well-equipped, and seemed to know exactly where the SEALs were positioned. Worse, they weren't trying to capture anyone. They were shooting to kill, including at the building containing the chemical lab. How long do we have? Morrison asked Hassan. 18 minutes when you breached the door. That was 4 minutes ago. Morrison realized with growing horror that they weren't the rescue force. They were the disposal team. Someone had sent them to eliminate Hassan and destroy the lab, not knowing or not caring that doing so would doom millions of Americans to death from a biological weapon. Who's behind this? Morrison demanded, but Hassan shook his head. Get me and the antidote to safety, and I'll tell you everything. But we need to move now, or none of us will survive to stop what's coming. Outside, the gunfire was intensifying. Sarah's voice came over the radio. Buildings surrounded. We're taking heavy fire from the north and east. They're using military-grade weapons and night vision. Morrison faced an impossible decision. Trust a known terrorist who claimed to be producing life-saving medicine, or follow his original orders and complete a mission that might result in countless American deaths. Either way, his team was trapped in a building rigged to explode in 14 minutes, surrounded by enemies who seemed to know their every move. Sir, what are your orders? Cruz asked over the radio. Morrison looked at Hassan, then at his men, then at the chemical equipment that might be humanity's last hope against a biological nightmare. Time was running out, and every second of delay brought them closer to disaster. Change of mission, Morrison said into his radio. We're now protecting the lab and extracting Hassan alive. Anyone who's got problems with that can file a complaint later. Hassan's expression showed what might have been relief. There's a way out through the laboratory basement, but we need to move the antidote containers first. They're too valuable to leave behind. How valuable? Morrison asked. Each container can save approximately 50,000 lives. Morrison counted the containers he could see through the doorway, at least 20 of them. Hassan wasn't just talking about saving lives. He was talking about saving civilization itself. The building shook again as enemy fire concentrated on their position. Clearly, someone desperately wanted this lab destroyed and everyone in it killed. Morrison was beginning to understand why Sarah and her brothers had been so cautious about taking action against Hassan. The situation was far more complex than anyone had realized. Williams, Cruz, start moving those containers to the basement, Morrison ordered. Mitchell, Anderson, establish defensive positions covering the lab. Everyone else, prepare for evacuation through the tunnel system. Sir, Rodriguez called from his position covering the front windows. We've got heavier weapons incoming. Looks like RPGs. Morrison realized they had minutes, not quarter hours, before the building became untenable. The mysterious enemy force wasn't just trying to kill them. They were trying to eliminate every trace of Hassan's operation before anyone could discover what was really happening. Hassan stood up carefully, his hands still raised. Lieutenant Commander, there's something else you need to know. The people shooting at us aren't foreign terrorists. They're American. Morrison stopped moving. What do you mean? Check their equipment, their tactics, their communications protocols. This is a domestic operation designed to look like a foreign attack. Through his scope, Mitchell confirmed Hassan's observation. Sir, those aren't AK-47s out there. They're M4 carbines. Standard U.S. military issue. Morrison felt the ground shifting under his feet again. If Hassan was telling the truth, then they weren't just facing enemy forces. They were facing Americans who'd been sent to kill them all and destroy the evidence of a biological attack on their own country. The timer was counting down, the enemy was closing in, and Morrison was beginning to realize that everything he'd been told about this mission was a lie. The revelation that American forces were attacking them changed everything. Morrison's radio buzzed with confused reports from his team as they realized their attackers were using U.S. military equipment and tactics. The implications were staggering. Either a military unit had gone rogue, or someone in the chain of command had ordered them eliminated. "This is a setup," Morrison said into his radio. "Unknown American forces are trying to destroy the lab and eliminate all witnesses. We're on our own." Hassan moved toward the window, staying low to avoid sniper fire. "Lieutenant Commander, the people who sent you here knew exactly what they were doing. They needed someone to blame for the biological attack when it becomes public knowledge." "Explain," Morrison demanded while directing his team to defensive positions. Foreign terrorists developing biological weapons in remote Louisiana laboratory, eliminated by brave Navy SEALs who tragically died preventing the weapons from being deployed, Hassan recited. Perfect cover story for a domestic operation. Williams' voice crackled over the radio from the chemical lab. "Sir, we've moved 6 containers to the basement, but some of this equipment can't be moved quickly. If we lose the main lab, we lose the ability to produce more antidote." Morrison assessed their situation. The building was surrounded by hostile American forces. The chemical lab was rigged to explode in 10 minutes, and they were supposedly protecting a terrorist who claimed to be saving American lives. Nothing made sense, and every decision could be the wrong one. Sarah's voice came through his earpiece. "Morrison, we've got incoming vehicles from the southeast. Military transport trucks, probably carrying reinforcements." Through Hassan's window, Morrison could see the approaching convoy. 3 trucks, military-grade, moving fast across the compound's access road. If those trucks were full of additional hostile forces, his 18 SEALs would be completely overwhelmed. "Who are they?" Morrison asked Hassan. "I don't know," Hassan admitted. "But whoever sent your team here has resources we didn't anticipate." Morrison made a critical decision. "Sarah, can your tunnel system support evacuation of the entire lab?" "Negative," she replied immediately. "Tunnel's too narrow for equipment, and we need hours to move everything through." The timer on Hassan's explosive device now showed 8 minutes. Morrison realized they were facing an impossible choice: save what antidote they could carry and abandon the lab's production capability, or try to defend an indefensible position against superior forces. That's when Cruz made an observation that changed everything. "Sir, the explosives aren't designed to destroy the building. They're set to create a chemical fire that would consume the antidote, but leave the structure intact." Morrison understood immediately. Whoever had rigged the explosives wanted the lab to survive physically. They just wanted to destroy the evidence of what Hassan had been producing. The building itself would serve as proof of the biological weapons story they were creating. "Can you disarm the device?" Morrison asked. Cruz was already examining the bomb mechanism. "It's sophisticated, but yeah, I think so. Give me 5 minutes." "You've got 3. Morrison replied as another RPG exploded against the building's outer wall. The approaching convoy had reached the compound, and Morrison could see armed figures deploying from the trucks with military precision. These weren't mercenaries or contractors. They moved like active-duty military units conducting a coordinated operation. Mitchell's voice came over the radio. "Sir, I've got positive ID on the incoming forces. They're wearing 75th Ranger Regiment patches." Morrison felt sick. The 75th Rangers were elite Army units, among America's finest soldiers. If Rangers were involved in this operation, it meant someone very high in the command structure had authorized the elimination of Morrison's team. "How many?" Morrison asked. "At least 40, probably more in the trucks we can't see." Morrison's 18 SEALs, plus Sarah and her brothers, against 40 Army Rangers in a building rigged to explode. The tactical situation was hopeless, but Morrison had sworn an oath to protect American lives. And if Hassan was telling the truth about the biological weapon, millions of those lives were at stake. Hassan moved closer to Morrison, speaking urgently. The biological attack was deployed in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, San Jose, Austin, and Jacksonville. Each city received different variants designed to spread through different population groups. Morrison's blood ran cold. Those were 12 of America's largest cities, containing tens of millions of people. If Hassan was correct about the virus's delayed lethality, those populations were living on borrowed time. Who released it? Morrison demanded. A private defense contractor called Meridian Solutions, Hassan replied. They developed it under the pretense of creating biodefense countermeasures. But their real goal was to create a crisis that would justify massive defense spending and expanded government surveillance powers. Cruz called out from the bomb. Sir, this device is more sophisticated than I thought. It's got multiple redundant triggers, and tampering with one might activate the others. The explosions outside were getting closer, and Morrison could hear the distinctive sound of M240 machine guns, the same weapons his team carried. The Rangers were using suppressive fire to pin down his men while they maneuvered for assault positions. Sarah's voice came through the radio with new urgency. Morrison, we've got problems. The Rangers are setting up a perimeter that includes the tunnel entrance. Our escape route is compromised. Morrison looked around the room at his options. The window faced east toward the swamp, but it was a 20-foot drop to uncertain ground. The hallway led back to the main lab where his men were fighting a delaying action against superior forces. The basement tunnel was blocked by enemy forces. Hassan, is there any other way out of here? Hassan pointed to what appeared to be a solid wall. There's a hidden passage behind that panel. It leads to an old pier on the bayou where we kept boats for supply runs. Morrison examined the wall and found the concealed door Hassan indicated. Behind it was a narrow passage that angled downward toward the water. It would be a tight squeeze for men in full combat gear, but it was their only remaining option. All units, prepare to evacuate through alternate route, Morrison ordered. Williams, Cruz, how many antidote containers can we carry? Maybe 8, if we abandon non-essential equipment, Williams replied. Morrison did quick math. 8 containers meant 400,000 lives saved, but millions more would still die if they couldn't preserve the lab's production capability. It was an impossible choice, but standing still meant everyone died. Cruz suddenly stood up from the explosive device. Sir, I can't disarm this thing safely, but I can set it to detonate early, before the Rangers breach the building. Morrison understood. If they triggered the explosion while enemy forces were approaching, it might eliminate the immediate threat while preserving some of the antidote in the basement levels that were protected by concrete and earth. Do it, Morrison ordered. 30-second delay. His team moved with the efficiency that came from years of training and trust. Williams and Rodriguez grabbed the most portable antidote containers while Mitchell and Anderson laid down covering fire. Sarah and her brothers appeared at the hidden passage entrance, having somehow fought their way through the Ranger perimeter. Hassan followed Morrison toward the passage, carrying a briefcase that he claimed contained documentation proving Meridian Solutions' involvement in the biological attack. This evidence will expose everything, he said, but only if we survive to deliver it. Cruz armed the explosive device and sprinted toward the passage as gunfire erupted in the hallway. The Rangers had breached the main entrance and were fighting room to room toward the chemical lab. Morrison's men were conducting a fighting withdrawal, but they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. 15 seconds, Cruz announced as the last SEAL entered the hidden passage. Morrison took one final look at the laboratory that might contain the only hope for saving American lives. Abandoning it felt like betraying everything he'd sworn to protect, but staying meant certain death for his entire team. He followed Hassan into the passage just as the building exploded behind them. The blast was enormous, far larger than Cruz's device should have produced. Apparently, the Rangers had been carrying additional explosives to ensure the lab's complete destruction. The shockwave knocked Morrison to his knees in the narrow passage, and debris rained down through cracks in the ceiling. When the dust cleared, Morrison realized they were trapped. The passage behind them was blocked by rubble, and ahead of them was an unknown route through unstable terrain. They were alive, but barely. and they had no idea if the antidote they'd saved would be enough to matter. Sarah's voice came from somewhere ahead in the darkness. Passage is clear for about 50 yards. Then, it opens into a natural cave system. The boats should be at the end if they haven't been discovered. Morrison followed her voice through the cramped passage, his mind racing through everything Hassan had told him. If even half of it was true, then they were carrying evidence of the largest terrorist attack in American history, conducted not by foreign enemies, but by Americans against their own people. The passage opened into a larger cave as Sarah had predicted, with phosphorescent water that provided an eerie green glow. Ancient wooden boats were tied to a crude dock, apparently undisturbed for years. Morrison's team quickly loaded the antidote containers and Hassan's evidence into the most seaworthy vessel. "Where do we go from here?" Morrison asked Sarah as they pushed off into the swamp. Sarah consulted a compass and pointed southeast. "There's an abandoned hunting lodge about 3 miles through the bayou. It's got radio equipment and a landing strip. From there, we can contact people who might actually be trustworthy." Morrison realized he had no idea who might be trustworthy anymore. If Hassan was correct about Meridian Solutions, then the conspiracy reached high into the government and military hierarchy. His own mission had been compromised from the beginning, and he had no way of knowing how deep the corruption went. As their boat moved silently through the dark water, Morrison looked back to see the compound burning in the distance. The chemical lab was gone, its production capability destroyed, and with it the ability to manufacture antidote quickly enough to save millions of lives. But they had survived, they had evidence, and they had enough antidote to at least begin treating some victims. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't total defeat either. And somewhere in the Louisiana swamp on Christmas morning, 18 Navy SEALs and one terrorist were planning to expose the greatest betrayal in American history. The revelation that American forces were attacking them changed everything. Morrison's radio buzzed with confused reports from his team as they realized their attackers were using U.S. military equipment and tactics. The implications were staggering. Either a military unit had gone rogue, or someone in the chain of command had ordered them eliminated. "This is a setup," Morrison said into his radio. "Unknown American forces are trying to destroy the lab and eliminate all witnesses. We're on our own." Hassan moved toward the window, staying low to avoid sniper fire. "Lieutenant Commander, the people who sent you here knew exactly what they were doing. They needed someone to blame for the biological attack when it becomes public knowledge." "Explain," Morrison demanded while directing his team to defensive positions. Foreign terrorists developing biological weapons in remote Louisiana laboratory, eliminated by brave Navy SEALs who tragically died preventing the weapons from being deployed, Hassan recited. Perfect cover story for a domestic operation. William's voice crackled over the radio from the chemical lab. "Sir, we've moved 6 containers to the basement, but some of this equipment can't be moved quickly. If we lose the main lab, we lose the ability to produce more antidote." Morrison assessed their situation. The building was surrounded by hostile American forces. The chemical lab was rigged to explode in 10 minutes, and they were supposedly protecting a terrorist who claimed to be saving American lives. Nothing made sense, and every decision could be the wrong one. Sarah's voice came through his earpiece. "Morrison, we've got incoming vehicles from the southeast. Military transport trucks, probably carrying reinforcements." Through Hassan's window, Morrison could see the approaching convoy. 3 trucks, military-grade, moving fast across the compound's access road. If those trucks were full of additional hostile forces, his 18 SEALs would be completely overwhelmed. "Who are they?" Morrison asked Hassan. "I don't know," Hassan admitted. "But whoever sent your team here has resources we didn't anticipate." Morrison made a critical decision. "Sarah, can your tunnel system support evacuation of the entire lab?" "Negative," she replied immediately. "Tunnel's too narrow for equipment, and we need hours to move everything through." The timer on Hassan's explosive device now showed 8 minutes. Morrison realized they were facing an impossible choice: save what antidote they could carry and abandon the lab's production capability, or try to defend an indefensible position against superior forces. That's when Cruz made an observation that changed everything. "Sir, the explosives aren't designed to destroy the building. They're set to create a chemical fire that would consume the antidote, but leave the structure intact. Morrison understood immediately. Whoever had rigged the explosives wanted the lab to survive physically. They just wanted to destroy the evidence of what Hassan had been producing. The building itself would serve as proof of the biological weapon story they were creating. "Can you disarm the device?" Morrison asked. Cruz was already examining the bomb mechanism. "It's sophisticated, but yeah, I think so. Give me 5 minutes." "You've got 3. Morrison replied as another RPG exploded against the building's outer wall. The approaching convoy had reached the compound, and Morrison could see armed figures deploying from the trucks with military precision. These weren't mercenaries or contractors. They moved like active-duty military units conducting a coordinated operation. Mitchell's voice came over the radio. "Sir, I've got positive ID on the incoming forces. They're wearing 75th Ranger Regiment patches." Morrison felt sick. The 75th Rangers were elite Army units, among America's finest soldiers. If Rangers were involved in this operation, it meant someone very high in the command structure had authorized the elimination of Morrison's team. "How many?" Morrison asked. "At least 40, probably more in the trucks we can't see." Morrison's 18 SEALs, plus Sarah and her brothers, against 40 Army Rangers in a building rigged to explode. The tactical situation was hopeless, but Morrison had sworn an oath to protect American lives. And if Hassan was telling the truth about the biological weapon, millions of those lives were at stake. Hassan moved closer to Morrison, speaking urgently. The biological attack was deployed in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, San Jose, Austin, and Jacksonville. Each city received different variants designed to spread through different population groups. Morrison's blood ran cold. Those were 12 of America's largest cities, containing tens of millions of people. If Hassan was correct about the virus's delayed lethality, those populations were living on borrowed time. Who released it? Morrison demanded. "A private defense contractor called Meridian Solutions," Hassan replied. "They developed it under the pretense of creating biodefense countermeasures. But their real goal was to create a crisis that would justify massive defense spending and expanded government surveillance powers." Cruz called out from the bomb. "Sir, this device is more sophisticated than I thought. It's got multiple redundant triggers, and tampering with one might activate the others." The explosions outside were getting closer, and Morrison could hear the distinctive sound of M240 machine guns, the same weapons his team carried. The Rangers were using suppressive fire to pin down his men while they maneuvered for assault positions. Sarah's voice came through the radio with new urgency. "Morrison, we've got problems. The Rangers are setting up a perimeter that includes the tunnel entrance. Our escape route is compromised." Morrison looked around the room at his options. The window faced east toward the swamp, but it was a 20-foot drop to uncertain ground. The hallway led back to the main lab where his men were fighting a delaying action against superior forces. The basement tunnel was blocked by enemy forces. "Hassan, is there any other way out of here?" Hassan pointed to what appeared to be a solid wall. "There's a hidden passage behind that panel. It leads to an old pier on the bayou where we kept boats for supply runs." Morrison examined the wall and found the concealed door Hassan indicated. Behind it was a narrow passage that angled downward toward the water. It would be a tight squeeze for men in full combat gear, but it was their only remaining option. "All units, prepare to evacuate through alternate route," Morrison ordered. "Williams, Cruz, how many antidote containers can we carry?" "Maybe 8, if we abandon non-essential equipment," Williams replied. Morrison did quick math. 8 containers meant 400,000 lives saved, but millions more would still die if they couldn't preserve the lab's production capability. It was an impossible choice, but standing still meant everyone died. Cruz suddenly stood up from the explosive device. "Sir, I can't disarm this thing safely, but I can set it to detonate early, before the Rangers breach the building." Morrison understood. If they triggered the explosion while enemy forces were approaching, it might eliminate the immediate threat while preserving some of the antidote in the basement levels that were protected by concrete and earth. "Do it," Morrison ordered. 30-second delay. His team moved with the efficiency that came from years of training and trust. Williams and Rodriguez grabbed the most portable antidote containers while Mitchell and Anderson laid down covering fire. Sarah and her brothers appeared at the hidden passage entrance, having somehow fought their way through the Ranger perimeter. Hassan followed Morrison toward the passage, carrying a briefcase that he claimed contained documentation proving Meridian Solutions' involvement in the biological attack. "This evidence will expose everything," he said, "but only if we survive to deliver it." Cruz armed the explosive device and sprinted toward the passage as gunfire erupted in the hallway. The Rangers had breached the main entrance and were fighting room to room toward the chemical lab. Morrison's men were conducting a fighting withdrawal, but they were outnumbered more than 2-1. 15 seconds, Cruz announced as the last SEAL entered the hidden passage. Morrison took one final look at the laboratory that might contain the only hope for saving American lives. Abandoning it felt like betraying everything he'd sworn to protect, but staying meant certain death for his entire team. He followed Hassan into the passage just as the building exploded behind them. The blast was enormous, far larger than Cruz's device should have produced. Apparently, the Rangers had been carrying additional explosives to ensure the lab's complete destruction. The shockwave knocked Morrison to his knees in the narrow passage, and debris rained down through cracks in the ceiling. When the dust cleared, Morrison realized they were trapped. The passage behind them was blocked by rubble, and ahead of them was an unknown route through unstable terrain. They were alive, but barely, and they had no idea if the antidote they'd saved would be enough to matter. Sarah's voice came from somewhere ahead in the darkness. "Passage is clear for about 50 yards. Then, it opens into a natural cave system. The boats should be at the end if they haven't been discovered." Morrison followed her voice through the cramped passage, his mind racing through everything Hassan had told him. If even half of it was true, then they were carrying evidence of the largest terrorist attack in American history, conducted not by foreign enemies, but by Americans against their own people. The passage opened into a larger cave as Sarah had predicted, with phosphorescent water that provided an eerie green glow. Ancient wooden boats were tied to a crude dock, apparently undisturbed for years. Morrison's team quickly loaded the antidote containers and Hassan's evidence into the most seaworthy vessel. "Where do we go from here?" Morrison asked Sarah as they pushed off into the swamp. Sarah consulted a compass and pointed southeast. "There's an abandoned hunting lodge about 3 miles through the bayou. It's got radio equipment and a landing strip. From there, we can contact people who might actually be trustworthy." Morrison realized he had no idea who might be trustworthy anymore. If Hassan was correct about Meridian Solutions, then the conspiracy reached high into the government and military hierarchy. His own mission had been compromised from the beginning, and he had no way of knowing how deep the corruption went. As their boat moved silently through the dark water, Morrison looked back to see the compound burning in the distance. The chemical lab was gone, its production capability destroyed, and with it the ability to manufacture antidote quickly enough to save millions of lives. But they had survived, they had evidence, and they had enough antidote to at least begin treating some victims. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't total defeat either. And somewhere in the Louisiana swamp on Christmas morning, 18 Navy SEALs and one terrorist were planning to expose the greatest betrayal in American history. The abandoned hunting lodge appeared through the morning mist like something from another era. Built on stilts over the swamp water, it had weathered decades of storms but remained solid. Sarah guided their boat to a hidden dock beneath the structure, where they could unload their precious cargo without being visible from the air. Morrison's team was exhausted, confused, and operating on nothing but trust in their commander's judgment. They'd spent Christmas Eve fighting Americans instead of terrorists, protecting a laboratory instead of destroying it, and saving evidence that could implicate their own government in mass murder. The lodge's radio equipment was old but functional. Sarah powered it up while Morrison tried to decide who he could safely contact. His normal chain of command was clearly compromised, but he needed to reach someone with enough authority to act on Hassan's evidence. "Sir," Williams said as they secured the antidote containers in the lodge's main room, "we need to make a decision about these samples. They need refrigeration, and we don't know how long they'll remain effective." "Hassan," who'd remained silent during their escape, finally spoke up. The antidote remains stable for 72 hours at ambient temperature. After that, it begins losing effectiveness rapidly. Morrison checked his watch. They'd been away from base for 8 hours, which meant they had less than 3 days to get the antidote to people who could distribute it to the affected cities. But first, they needed to verify Hassan's claims about the biological attack. David Tran had been monitoring police and emergency frequencies during their boat journey. "I'm picking up unusual medical emergency reports from multiple cities," he reported. "Hospitals are seeing increased flu cases, but the symptoms don't match normal seasonal patterns." Morrison felt his stomach drop. Hassan's timeline was proving accurate. If the virus had been released 3 days ago, the first wave of symptoms would be appearing now. The second, lethal wave would begin in 4 days unless the antidote could be distributed. Sarah finished connecting the radio equipment and handed Morrison the microphone. "Who are you going to call?" Morrison thought carefully. He needed someone outside the normal military chain of command, someone with enough authority to act independently, and someone he trusted absolutely. Only one name came to mind: Admiral Rebecca Chun, Naval Special Warfare Command. Morrison said as he adjusted the radio frequency. Admiral Chun had been his commanding officer during his first SEAL deployment, and she'd built a reputation for protecting her people regardless of political pressure. The radio connection took several minutes to establish, bouncing through military satellites and encrypted channels. When Admiral Chin's voice finally came through clearly, Morrison felt relief wash over him. "Admiral Chun, this is Lieutenant Commander Morrison, call sign Bravo 6. "Jake Morrison?" Chin's voice showed surprise. "You're supposed to be on Christmas leave. What's your location and status?" Morrison looked around at his men, at Sarah and her brothers, at Hassan sitting quietly with his briefcase of evidence. "Admiral, I need to report a compromised mission with national security implications. Request immediate secure channel for classified debrief." There was a pause before Chin responded. "Stand by for frequency change." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. Morrison described everything: the failed intelligence, the trap at the compound, the mysterious sniper family, Hassan's claims about biological weapons, and the attack by American forces. Admiral Chin listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification but never expressing disbelief. Hassan provided additional details when Morrison put him on the radio. His description of Meridian Solutions, their government contracts, and the biological weapon deployment was thorough and specific. He named names, cited contract numbers, and provided technical details that would be impossible to fabricate. Finally, Admiral Chin asked the question Morrison had been dreading. "Jake, do you believe this man's claims?" Morrison looked at Hassan, then at the antidote containers, then at his exhausted team who'd risked everything based on his judgment. "Admiral, I believe someone released a biological weapon targeting American cities. I believe Hassan was producing antidote, not weapons. And I believe we were sent to destroy the evidence." "The Rangers who attacked you, did you recognize any unit designations?" 75th Regiment. But something was wrong. Their tactical callouts weren't standard, and their equipment configuration suggested they weren't operating under normal command authority. Chin was quiet for several moments before responding. "Jake, I'm going to share classified information that doesn't leave this channel. We've had reports of unusual medical symptoms in 12 major cities over the past 48 hours. CDC is investigating, but they've been ordered to treat it as a routine flu outbreak." Morrison felt vindication and terror in equal measure. Hassan's claims were being corroborated by independent sources, which meant the biological attack was real and the cover-up was already beginning. "Admiral, we have enough antidote to treat maybe 400,000 people. The lab that could produce more was destroyed. Millions are going to die if we can't find another source. Stand by." Another voice came on the radio, older, male, with the authority of someone used to making life and death decisions quickly. "Commander Morrison, this is General Patricia Hayes, Joint Chiefs of Staff. I've been briefed on your situation. We need you to bring your evidence and the antidote to Naval Air Station New Orleans immediately." Morrison's training told him to obey orders from a general, but his experience told him to be cautious. If the conspiracy reached high enough, Even the Joint Chiefs might be compromised. General, with respect, how do we know this isn't another setup? Because, Commander, I've been investigating Meridian Solutions for 6 months. Your evidence might be the key to stopping them before the second wave of the biological attack becomes active. Hassan leaned toward the radio microphone. General Hayes, this is Hassan. What can you tell me about Meridian's Project Clear Sky? There was a sharp intake of breath from the radio. How do you know about Clear Sky? Because I helped design the original biodefense protocols they corrupted, Hassan replied. I was working as a consultant when I discovered what they were really planning. That's why I disappeared and started producing antidote independently. Morrison felt pieces of a massive puzzle clicking into place. Hassan wasn't just a terrorist who'd stumbled onto American biological weapons. He was a scientist who'd discovered a conspiracy from the inside and gone underground to fight it. General, what's our extraction procedure? Morrison asked. Helicopter pickup at coordinates I'm transmitting now. You'll be met by people you can trust. I'm sending Admiral Chin personally to debrief you. Morrison looked at Sarah, who'd been listening to the entire conversation. What about civilians who assisted our operation? They'll be protected under the Whistleblower Protection Act and given full military honors for their service, General Hayes replied immediately. Their assistance in exposing this conspiracy makes them national heroes. Sarah exchanged glances with her brothers. They'd spent months hunting Hassan, only to discover he was trying to save American lives. Now they were being offered recognition for helping expose the people who'd killed their father. We accept, Marcus said quietly. Morrison began organizing his team for extraction, but Hassan raised a critical concern. General, even with the antidote we've preserved, we can only treat a fraction of the affected population. The biological weapon was designed to be highly contagious. By the time symptoms appear, each infected person has already exposed hundreds of others. What do you recommend? General Hayes asked. Hassan opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. Meridian Solutions has 3 other production facilities where they manufacture the original biological weapon. If we can capture those facilities intact, we can reverse engineer the production process and create antidote in sufficient quantities. Morrison studied the facility locations Hassan provided. 2 were in the United States, 1 in Montana, 1 in Florida. The third was in a private research facility in Switzerland. Capturing them would require coordinated military operations on an unprecedented scale. General, this is bigger than one SEAL team can handle, Morrison said. I know, Hayes replied. I'm already mobilizing Joint Special Operations Command for simultaneous raids on all 3 facilities. But I need your team to lead the Montana operation. You're the only people who've seen what we're really dealing with. Morrison looked around at his men. They were exhausted, but they were also the finest warriors America had ever produced. If millions of lives depended on their actions, they would find a way to succeed. What's the timeline? Morrison asked. Helicopter extraction in 2 hours. Mission briefing at 1,400 hours. Operation launches at 0200 tomorrow morning, Christmas Day. Sarah checked the radio equipment one final time before shutting it down. Seems like your Christmas leave is officially over, she said to Morrison with dark humor. Morrison thought about his family, his friends, all the people celebrating Christmas morning who had no idea that their lives depended on the success of operations they'd never hear about. If Hassan and General Hayes were correct, this Christmas would either mark the defeat of the largest terrorist attack in history or the beginning of a biological catastrophe that could kill millions. Sir, Rodriguez said as they prepared to move to the extraction point, what do we tell people about what happened here? Morrison considered the question. The official story would probably never include the full truth, the involvement of American forces, the government conspiracy, the role of a terrorist who turned out to be a hero. Most of it would remain classified forever. We tell them that American service members and patriotic civilians worked together to prevent a biological weapons attack on Christmas Eve, Morrison said finally. Everything else is above our pay grade. As they loaded their gear and the precious antidote containers into boats for the journey to the extraction point, Morrison reflected on how much had changed in 12 hours. They'd begun the mission hunting a terrorist and ended it exposing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Hassan packed his evidence carefully, ensuring that every document was protected from water damage. Lieutenant Commander, do you think we'll be able to stop them? Morrison looked across the Louisiana swamp, where Spanish moss hung like Christmas decorations on ancient trees. Somewhere out there, General Hayes was mobilizing the most sophisticated military force in human history to prevent a biological catastrophe. In 3 cities around the world, SEAL teams would be launching simultaneous raids based on intelligence provided by a terrorist who'd risked everything to save American lives. I think, Morrison said as their boats moved toward the extraction point, that the people who started this war picked the wrong enemy. The helicopter appeared over the tree line exactly on schedule, its rotors cutting through the Christmas morning air like a promise that the mission was far from over. Morrison's 18 SEALs, plus Sarah and her brothers, plus one former terrorist with evidence that could save millions of lives, were about to become part of something larger than any of them had imagined. As they lifted off from the Louisiana swamp, Morrison could see the burned remains of Hassan's compound in the distance. The chemical laboratory was gone, but the knowledge it had contained was now in the hands of people who could use it to save rather than destroy. It wasn't the Christmas Eve any of them had planned, but it might be the most important Christmas in American history.